Hi, this is Bernhard Riemann and this is the fifth part of the TORCS car modeling tutorial. In this part I will explain you the physical car model parameters and the TORCS car model. If you want to repeat or follow the tutorial, you can download the car model here. Okay, let's start. We open up car2.xml. As you might remember from the previous tutorial, this file contains all the parameters regarding the car. That means the physical parameters and the graphical ones. So let's start scrolling through the file. The file starts here with the driver section. You remember that from part 4 of the tutorial. We set here the driver position. This defines the view from the inside of the car. The next section is the sound section. This defines the engine sample. So the engine noise is defined by this. The RPM scale is for scaling the frequency. Then the next section contains graphics objects. In the graphical options of TORCS you can set up a simple or complex wheel rendering model. For the simple wheel rendering model, this is the texture which is used here. For the complex wheel rendering, the model for the wheel down here is used. Here you can additionally define multiple options for that car so that the user of that car can choose different wheels. So basically this car can use the wheel stock 1.1, stock 1.2 and stock 1.3, and the default option is stock 1.2. Then we find in this section as well the shadow.rgb. You know this as well from the previous tutorials. Then you have some tachometer and speedometer textures here. You can customize these if you like. Just have a look at the existing ones as templates and throw your own ones into the cars directory, then TORCS will pick it up. The next section is the ranges section. Here you can set up multiple models for your car for so-called level of detail. So if the car is farther away from the camera, it can use a low polygon model for it. And here you can define various models for that. For simplicity we have defined just one model here, and this is the default one. If you want to look how this works, look at existing cars. A few of them have level of details implemented, so have a look there how this works. The next section is the light section. Here the lights of the car are defined. Have a look as well on existing models what is possible here. So, and finally we end up with the interesting section, the car section. So we start playing with the physical parameters. But let's start at the beginning. As you might remember from the previous tutorial, the car belongs to a category which defines valid ranges for parameters. And we have chosen the category 3. You can review this in the previous tutorials. Here the body length, width and height is defined. We adopted this as well in the previous tutorials, and the collision bounding box as well. And here it finally starts with new stuff. So here we hit the first very interesting parameter. This is called GC height, and it means the height of the center of gravity regarding braking and acceleration. The higher this parameter is set, the more load shift you get on braking and accelerating. Beware, this parameter does not define the center of gravity height regarding car body rolling, because suspension geometry plays a role there too. The parameter is relative to the car bottom. Before we change it, let's review the current behavior of the car. As you can see, there are slight pitch changes of the car under acceleration and braking. So let's go back and change the parameter. I will set it absolute extremely to show you the effect. We set it to 2 meters. Then, as in the previous tutorials, we need to deploy the changed file. So we copy this. So, and we are ready to test. As you can see, the effect is pretty extreme, which was expected. Additionally, you recognize that TORCS limits the degrees of freedom, so the car cannot go upside down or something like that. Okay, let's set this back. And as next, because it is related, I will show you the car body rolling parameters. Each axle defines its own roll center height. This is kind of a virtual center of gravity for this axle, which defines how the forces act. As I see here, I have from a previous experiment here still 2 big values in it. Per default they are lower, but let's set it more extreme and test what it does. As you can see, on the slightest turn the car body rolls now to the side pretty extremely, because the center of gravity regarding rolling is in 2 meters height. But you can observe as well that if you operate TORCS with insane values, that the behavior might become a bit strange, because this is absolutely at the limits which are artificially limited by TORCS. A little side note here: if you want to know how forces are actually calculated, you can open up the TORCS source code and review it. Let's do this now. So here you can see basically the moment calculation which consider the car body rolling. you find all the simulation code under Simu v2. In case you're interested, there you can find the physical model for the transmission, the tire model, and so on. Just a side note. Okay, so let's go back to the XML. So we are done with the center of gravity. The next thing is mass. Mass is including driver but without fuel. So there's nothing special to say about that. The weight bias defines how the weight is distributed in the car. So if your car has more weight on the front axle than on the rear axle, you can define this here. So if this front rear weight repartition would be 1.0, the whole weight would be on the front axle and no weight on the rear axle. The 0.48 means that this car has a bit more load on the rear axle than on the front axle. The right-left weight repartition denotes if the weight is not in the middle of the car regarding the axle. The mass repartition coefficient defines how the mass is centered. So the farther away the mass is in the car from the center of gravity, the bigger this parameter is. So the smaller the value is, the more agile is the car, and the bigger the value is, the more it will feel like a brick. The next two parameters are the fuel tank size. It just defines how much fuel goes into the tank. And the initial fuel defines the default value which is in the tank for that car. What is to mention additionally is that 1 liter of fuel in TORCS weighs always 1 kilogram. So basically this is the same like the weight of the fuel. Okay, let's perform some experiment with the mass repartition coefficient. First we set it to the lowest possible value and try it. Oh, hold on, we have to change back the roll center height. Otherwise we will not see what happens. So as you can see, the car is very agile with this setting and reacts directly to steering input. Okay, let's set the parameter to the maximum. And see what happens. As you can see, although the steering is maxed out, the car barely turns, so you can really feel the inertia and how sluggish it is. Okay, let's change that back to normal and to go forward in the file. So the section exhaust is for defining the exhaust flames. Because our car does not have modeled exhausts, we have disabled this. Just have a look in other model how this works. But basically you can give the position and how dense the flames are and similar parameters. The next section is the aerodynamics section of the car. We have here the drag coefficient called Cx and the front area of the car. The front and rear C-lift factors are for adjusting the ground effect of the car. The front C-lift acts on the front axle, the rear C-lift on the rear axle. The resulting ground effect depends as well on the ride height and speed of the car and other factors. To get an idea about the values you need, you can review the existing car models or to have a look into the simulation model. Normal street cars should have around 0.0 because they have more or less no ground effect. Okay, the next section to review are the wing sections. We have here a front and a rear wing. They both have an area, an angle and a position, so it's easy to figure out. If your car has no front wing but kind of a splitter, you can model this as front wing without adjustable angle of attack, so you would define the minimum and the maximum angle as the same angle, so you cannot adjust the angle of attack. But then you can model the force correctly. The next section is the engine section. This defines obviously the properties of the engine. You can see here the maximum RPM, the RPM limiter and the tickover. The tickover defines the minimum RPM the engine has to run. It does never fall below this RPM. There is kind of an anti-stall system implemented in TORCS, so you can never switch off the engine currently. The fuel consumption factor defines how much fuel your engine consumes. And the most alien one here is the brake coefficient. This coefficient is responsible for the negative torque the engine produces when you lift the accelerator on a high RPM. In reality, this is controlled by the ECU usually, which can shift ignition points or various parameters to get the desired torque. If this is very high, it can be that when you lift the accelerator suddenly, that your rear will spin out. As next are following the data points of the torque curve of the engine. What is to mention here, that there is given a certain resolution from the car class, and the values which are given from the car class must be always overridden. You can additionally insert data points in between, but the basic data points have to be defined always. As you can see, these are just RPM torque pairs. The next section defines the gearbox. We have here a shift time. For a modern open wheel car, this can be nearly 0.0 the shift time. For a normal sequential gearbox it might be a bit more, and for manual shifting it might be quite a long time, so you can adjust that to your needs. Then as next the gears are defined, here the reverse gear. So for a gear you have to give the ratio, the inertia and the efficiency. The smaller the efficiency is, the more power gets lost into running this gear, and the bigger inertia is, the harder it is to accelerate the drivetrain. Then the normal gears are following here. You can give up to 9 gears if required. Some words to the ratio. As a ratio you can take any number you like. You don't need to take care of teeth of real gearboxes, but of course you can calculate the parameters such that it fits real gear ratios. Then the next section is steer section. Here you can set the steer lock. This is the maximum steering angle of the front wheels which is possible. So for a street car this might be more, for an extreme race car this might be less. The max steer speed defines how fast the steering angle can change. Okay, the next section is the drivetrain section. Here you can define your drivetrain. In this case this is rear wheel driven, RWD. There exists as well front wheel driven and four wheel driven. So as example, let's open a four-wheel driven car. Now we can search here for drivetrain. And we do not find it, so that means it is defined in the category. So you can see this is the category which has to define that. Let's open that. So as you can see in this example, here is the value four-wheel driven, and as you can see additionally you can give here an inertia as well. Okay, let's go back. The next section is the differential section. The rear wheel driven car has of course just one differential. There you have several types you can choose from. Here in the list for this car is spool, free and limited slip. And the choice goes for free. Free is the differential you find on old classic cars. On more modern cars there might be some kind of limited slip differential or a free differential. A limited slip differential is a differential which does not allow to rotate the wheels completely free. As additional type there's the spool. This means there is no differential at all, so the left and the rear wheel are just plainly coupled, so they drive at the same speed. Now let's go back to the four-wheel driven car as example, because this has a much more interesting differential setup. As you can see here, this has a central differential, so the engine is coupled with the central differential, and after that it goes to the front and to the rear differential. And as you can see, for the front and rear differential, there are the same choices like in our tutorial car, but for the central differential there is additionally a vicious coupler type differential. If you want to know how these differentials work exactly, I can recommend you to look into the code. We do this now. So, let's see. So as you see, the free differential is a very simple being. So that's what you would think of it. The limited slip differential is a bit more complicated thing. This has various parameters you see here. The differential lock input torque. If the input torque of the engine is bigger than this torque, the differential is completely locked. And if the torque fades out or is lower, it gives more and more slip. So the lower the input torque is, the more slip is allowed. If you do not want to rely on example car files to find the parameters, you can go to the initial parts of the physical components and see what's loaded. Usually there's a config section for each component, and here you can see which parameters are read into the model. So here, if you hover over, depending on your development environment, you can see which parameter that is and what defaults are set if it is not given. So this way you can explore the model and understand the parameters. Fair enough. Let's go back to our XML. The next section here is the brake system. You can define here the front-rear brake repartition. This is what you usually call the brake balance. It's just how much braking pressure is applied to the front and to the rear. This is the distribution of the pressure. The next is the maximum pressure, so this defines how much force can be applied by the brake system. Then the next two sections are the axles. You know this from previous tutorials and from the first part today. We already have discussed this. Then the next interesting sections are the wheel sections. There's the sections for the front right wheel, front left wheel, rear right and rear left. And you can set up all individually, as you can see. So you can create asymmetric setups like in NASCAR oval racing or something, where the cars go more or less sideways when they drive straight. Okay, let's start. There's the position of the wheel relative to the center of the car. The position along the car is defined by the axle, so there's just a Y position needed here. So the sideway offset. Then the rim diameter is given, that's easy. The tire width is given and the tire width height ratio. And the wheel has an inertia. So this is all pretty clear. Then here is the initial ride height. Why initial ride height? This is the ride height when the car stands still. If the car drives at high speed and it's a racing car, then it has downforce and the suspension is compressed because of that, so the ride height is probably lower. Or if you have some dynamics with hitting bumps, then the ride height is not constant. So this is the steady, still standing ride height. The toe is just a toe as you would expect it, and the camber as well. What you can see here, that you cannot define caster. That is missing in the simulation model currently. So we don't have caster. Then stiffness, dynamic friction, rolling resistance, and mu are parameters of the tire itself. So the stiffer a tire is, the preciser it gets to steer, but also more unforgiving. Dynamic friction is how much part of the friction is generated through slip and how much is statically there. So the more dynamic friction you have, the more forgiving the tire is, and the less dynamic friction you have, the less forgiving it is. Rolling resistance is just rolling resistance, and mu is just a kind of a general grip parameter. So the higher the mu is, the more grip you have. Let's have a quick look into the tire model into the source code. You find this in wheel.cpp. You can see here as well the config section, and here you can see what parameters are available and loaded. And you can find here parameters which are used in no XML files so far. For example, this is the pressure. Why is this not used yet? Because tire temperature is not simulated currently in Simu v2. In Simu v3 it is simulated, but this is not a default simulation which is used. Here you can find actually the calculation of the forces of the tire, and you can see that this is a standard industry strength tire model. You can find this as well on Wikipedia. So, if you are interested into the tire model we use for TORCS, this is basically this one. And as you will see when you read further, this tire model is pretty good at normal speeds, but it is not so good at very low speeds, because the slip gets very big at low speeds, and so the formula gets kind of problematic. There are proposed solutions for that, but this is not yet implemented in TORCS. So there is potential for improvement at very low speed around still standing. You might have recognized this, that when TORCS is running and the car is still standing, that the wheels are slightly turning all the time. This is partly because of that. I will show you this. Hold on. In the beginning everything is fine, but once the system has moved, there is no stopping anymore. You see now how the front wheel and rear wheel are kind of turning a bit. If you need a reminder what makes the tire more forgiving or more precise, you can search the net for this. Search for TORCS tire model forgiving, then you end up in our mailing list, and I answered there once a mail regarding this. You can read this thread, then you will get some information about this, just as pointer. So let's go forward. The next section defines the properties of the anti-roll bars. Anti-roll bars are there to prevent car body rolling. They kind of couple the left and the right suspension. So if the left suspension is compressed, there is force transfer to the right side so that it is a bit compressed as well. As you can see, you can set up here the spring. The bell crank is legacy. In fact, this parameter is not used anymore, so we can remove that. And you can see that we inherit from our model we copied as base for our car tooth model. We have an anti-roll bar set here. With anti-roll bars you can control the handling of the car, so you can adjust your under and over steering. What the simulation model does not support is dynamic anti-roll bars. For example, I have seen in V8 supercars, this is an Australian racing series, that they have a control in the cockpit which they use to switch on and off the anti-roll bars. This is currently not supported in TORCS. Okay, then we are done with the anti-roll bars. The next is the suspension sections. You can set up the suspension for each wheel individually, as you can see here. It's the same like before, so you can do asymmetric setups. So let's start here. You can set the spring value, the stiffness of the spring, and the suspension course. Let's assume first that the bell crank is 1, which is the case here. I come back to that later. So the suspension course must be always bigger than the initial ride height, because otherwise it's kind of a contradiction that the suspension cannot travel as far as the initial ride height is desired, and this will cause a weird behavior because the suspension is then stuck on the outmost position it can be, and if the car hits a little bump and the car goes up, the suspension cannot extend at all, it can just compress. So it is important that the suspension course is always bigger than the initial ride height. This is for bell crank equals 1. If the bell crank is not 1, then this is scaled with the bell crank. The bell crank is kind of a lever which translates the forces and the travel. We can have a look in the code. This is here. So you can see how this is scaled here with the bell crank, and here is checked if the suspension is on the maximum. Then the packers are a thing to limit the compression. So if you don't want the suspension to be compressed up to 0, you can set packers so that your car body does not hit the road. The suspension model in TORCS is such that if the suspension is completely compressed, that the car bottom hits the floor. So for that you can use packers, then you can maintain a minimal distance, a minimal ride height. The next settings to discuss are slow bump, slow rebound, fast bump and fast rebound. These are the damper settings. Let's have a look on the net. I search here for Fast bump, rebound, damper, velocity, force. Just get the first link. So, and what we get here is a velocity force diagram. So you can see basically that up to a certain velocity, the force goes constantly up more or less. In the idealized case, this would be straight here. And then on a certain threshold, the slope is lower. So you can think of this is the slow rebound case, and this is the fast rebound case, or bump, depends of course. So what physically happens in the damper is if the velocity of the travel is below a certain threshold, the damping is on the slow value, and if the damper moves faster, then the fast bump gets active additionally, like you have seen from the diagram. And so you can adjust differently here how the damping should be regarding, let's say, car handling, like it should damp if you steer or brake or accelerate, or for the fast things if you hit the curb, for example. We can have a look as well in the simulation model. You can see that here, how this is calculated. And what is important here, you cannot set up a certain parameter, I guess. Yes. So the threshold which you have seen in the diagram is here currently at 0.5 meters per second. In a later version I will make this an adjustable parameter, because if you buy such a damper, there are things available which have 0.5 like this. This is a real value, but you can have as well down to 0.1. So there's a certain range, and depending on the car speeds and setup, it is desirable to set this up as well. But currently it is just 0.5. By the way, you might ask now, how do you model a classic damper which has no fast bump and rebound? This is very easy. Just set fast bump and rebound to the same values as slow bound and rebound. So then the simulated valve opens, but it does not change anything. So it is then perfectly normal damper. Let's go forward. As you can see, we are more or less done with the file. Here is just some brake disc parameters which are pretty easy to understand and set up. There are more, maybe we can see those with this car here. Yes, you can see here is the disc diameter, piston area, the friction, and as well inertia, which you can set. So it's all pretty easy to understand. So what you might ask, if you are a high performance car fan, if the third element is simulated. This is a part of the suspension system on open wheel cars, for example, and we do not have the third element in our suspension. We have discussed here the per wheel suspension and the anti-roll bars and the axles, but as you have seen, there is no third element. This is not simulated currently. Then we could discuss as well, how do you get the parameters to match the model you like. Just Google for your car you want to model, and quite often you find even telemetry data, for example in Trackpedia or so. We can have a look just to give it a try. So you might find there lap times for certain car types or telemetry traces and so on. For example, you have here some lap times, and here you have seem to be available some kind of telemetry. So if you look for it, you can find a lot of information. Yes, here you can see the speeds at the sectors and so on. So you can gain a lot of information. You can watch as well YouTube videos, especially of accidents. This reveals quite a lot about of the mass distribution of cars, how fast they go into a spin, how they spin, how the spin is absorbed when they hit the barrier or the tire wall. So you can guesstimate a lot of parameters from that. Maybe some last words regarding test driving. You should do the setup and the test driving in Pro mode, otherwise you have too much grip and then you get the wrong impression of the car. As you might know, if you choose in the player options Rookie, Semi-Pro or Amateur, you get more grip, and that's not good for test driving. The final setup should be tendentially a bit understeering in Pro mode, because if you go to the easier modes you have more grip, and this means that the car gets more neutral than regarding braking, because the deceleration is faster. Okay, finally I could try to show you how to make a robot do the test driving if you do not want to test drive all this by yourself. So let's give a try to set up a robot to do test drives. I navigate to the drivers and I will choose Inferno 3 as test driver. For that I need to modify the default XML file, so I copy that to the desktop. And then the inferno.xml. Now I change the car to cartut in default.xml and remove all the contents. That means the full setup is taken from the car definition, so we have no local changes. Then we set up the robot definition to use the car we like. So we say here, use the cartut car. Save everything and copy back the files. Okay, let's see if this works. Oops. We choose here now Inferno 3. And as you can see in the middle in the category, it's free and the car is car-tut. So this should work. Okay, let's start. Ah, great. Oops, there's some jerky action, so I guess we have still the setup of the car active, which has the big inertia for the car body. Because you see it steers to the max, but the car does not turn. So let's fix that. Let's see how it works now. Okay, great. What you have to consider that the robots are driving in semi-pro mode per default. So it's not pro mode. And most of them have a bright conservative driving style, so they are not operating fully at the limit. So you have to do test driving by yourself too. But it gives an impression how a robot does with the car. Okay, nice. That's it. We finished the lap and then we are done. Okay, I guess this was already way too much information for one day, so I just recommend you to download the tutorial model and to play with all the parameters, try things yourself. Don't worry if it explodes, you can always go back. So just try it and have a good time. So I hope you enjoyed this video and maybe see you the next time. Bye!